February 4th, 1982. 800 miles from any coastline. A sailor wakes up to a sound that will shatter his world. Crack. Something just punched through his boat like it was paper, and water's flooding in faster than he can think. He's got 3 minutes before this boat becomes his coffin. What happens next? 76 days that will rewrite everything experts thought they knew about ocean survival. Because here's what they don't tell you about Steven Callahan's story. The technique that saved his life was so revolutionary that when the United States Navy found out about it, they immediately added it to their official survival training program. And it's still being taught to sailors today, 43 years later. By the end of this video, you'll know the exact method Steven used, the one that 98% of sailors have never heard of, the one that's still saving lives right now. But first, you need to understand how a 29-year-old boat designer ended up fighting for his life in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Steven Callahan wasn't some weekend sailor playing around. This guy was a naval architect who designed boats for a living and built them with his own hands. In 1981, he did something most people only dream about. He sailed solo across the Atlantic from Rhode Island to England completely alone. Just him and his 21-foot sailboat he'd named Napoleon Solo. Think about that for a second. 3,000 miles of open ocean with no backup, no crew, just one man and a boat he built himself. Most people can't handle being alone for 3 days. Steven did it for weeks. After spending time in England, he decided to sail back, left from the Canary Islands on January 29, 1982, with his destination set for Antigua in the Caribbean. The first week was perfect with steady winds, clear skies, and Steven living the dream he'd worked his entire life for. But on day 7, everything changed. A storm started building. Nothing crazy at first because the Atlantic gets rough, and it's part of the deal. Steven went to sleep that night thinking he'd wake up to calmer seas. Instead, he woke up to chaos. Crack. The sound of his boat being destroyed. Something massive had just hit Napoleon Solo hard enough to punch a hole straight through the hull. A whale? Maybe. A huge shark? Possibly. Nobody knows for sure, and that's what makes this terrifying, because whatever it was had enough force to rip through a boat designed to handle Atlantic storms. Water started flooding the cabin, cold and dark, and rising fast. And Steven had maybe 3 minutes before his boat sank. Most people would freeze, panic, make fatal mistakes. Steven did something different. He inflated his emergency life raft, a 6-foot circle of rubber designed to hold 6 people. It was about to become his entire world for the next 2.5 months. But here's where Steven made the decision that would save his life. Before Napoleon Solo went under, he dove back into the flooding cabin. Not once, not twice. 3 times. Into a boat that was actively sinking in the middle of a storm in complete darkness. Why would anyone do that? Because Steven understood something most people don't. The difference between life and death isn't luck. It's preparation. He grabbed his emergency kit with flares, a spear gun, and 3 solar stills for making drinking water. He grabbed a sleeping bag, a cushion, and a survival manual written by another ocean survivor. Then the ocean ripped his raft away from the boat, and Steven Callahan was alone, floating on 6 feet of rubber in the middle of nowhere. Now here's what nobody tells you about being lost at sea. It's not like the movies where you just sit there waiting for rescue. Survival is active, constant, exhausting. Every single second of every single day is a fight. And Steven knew something that would become his survival mantra. You can't control if a ship sees you. You can't control the weather. You can't control if sharks attack. But you can control your response. So Steven made a plan. First priority, water. He had maybe 2 liters from the boat, which gives you 3 days maximum, and after that, you're dead. Steven had 3 solar stills, these balloon devices that should turn seawater into drinking water. But when he tried them, they didn't work. Now imagine this. You're dying of thirst in the middle of the ocean, surrounded by water you can't drink, and the only devices that can save you are broken. Most people would give up right there. Steven did something shocking. He cut one of them apart. While he was dying of thirst in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, he sacrificed one of his 3 water makers just to figure out how it worked. Think about the courage that takes. You're gambling your life on your ability to fix something you've never seen before. One wrong move, and you've just killed yourself. But Steven figured it out, used that knowledge to fix the other 2. Those two stills could produce about a pint of water per day, barely enough to keep a person alive. But it worked. And now we get to the part that changes everything: the sharks. Because sharks don't just show up randomly, they show up for a reason. Within days of Steven's boat sinking, something incredible started happening. Fish began to gather underneath his raft. Now, here's what mainstream survival experts won't tell you. Anything floating in the ocean becomes its own ecosystem, its own island. Barnacles start growing on the bottom, tiny organisms attached to the surface. Small fish come to eat those organisms, and bigger fish come to eat the small fish. Steven's raft was creating a food chain. First came triggerfish that tasted horrible, bitter and tough, and almost inedible. But Steven ate them anyway. Then something miraculous happened. A school of about 50 dorado fish showed up. These are also called mahi-mahi, beautiful creatures that are bright blue and gold, 3 to 4 feet long, 20 to 30 pounds each. They started following Steven's raft everywhere, swimming alongside him during the day and circling beneath him at night. They became his companions, his friends, his food supply. But here's the problem. Steven had a small spear gun to catch fish, but he was on an inflatable raft. One wrong move with a sharp spear, and he'd puncture the only thing keeping him alive. And then, on day 12, the spear gun broke, completely useless. Now Steven had no way to catch fish, except this is where the one trick comes in. The technique that would later become part of Navy survival training, the method that sailors around the world now learn. Steven noticed something strange about the dorado fish. When he pressed his knees into the bottom of the raft, creating a small depression, the fish would come closer. They'd rub against the bottom, curious, investigating. So Steven started experimenting. He'd press his knees down to create a dip in the raft's floor. The dorados would gather directly underneath that spot, and in that moment, he could reach over the side and stab them by hand. No tools and no equipment, just understanding fish behavior. Steven must have whispered to himself after that first successful catch. It actually worked. This became known as the Callahan method. And here's why the Navy cares. Because it works with any inflatable survival craft. You don't need a spear gun that might break. You don't need equipment that might fail. You just need to understand one simple principle. Fish are curious. They investigate changes in their environment. And you can use that curiosity to feed yourself. The Navy tested this technique after Steven's rescue. It works every single time. So they added it to their survival training program, made it standard procedure for all naval personnel. Because when Steven Callahan proved this technique worked in real survival conditions, it changed how the United States Navy teaches ocean survival worldwide. And that's still happening today. But the story gets crazier, because the fish weren't the only thing Steven had to deal with. Sharks showed up every single day. Hammerheads, bull sharks, species Steven couldn't even identify. They'd circle the raft for hours, bump the bottom testing it, race through the Dorado school, and scatter them. Steven knew that if one shark got aggressive, he was finished. And on day 43, his worst nightmare almost came true. Steven was fighting a particularly strong Dorado. The fish was thrashing violently, and in the struggle, Steven's makeshift spear jammed into the bottom of the raft and tore a 4-inch hole in the tube. Water started rushing in. Air started rushing out. The raft began to sink. For an entire week, Steven fought to fix that hole. Every patch he tried would fail when he pumped air back in because the pressure would break the seal. He was working with his hands underwater while sharks were circling closer because they could smell fish blood. His raft was slowly deflating. This was the moment Steven broke. He screamed at the ocean, cried, had what he later called a full tantrum because he tried everything and nothing worked. This was how he was going to die. Steven looked at his hands covered in salt sores and bleeding from the constant work. There has to be a way, he said to himself. There has to be. And then he did something that separates survivors from victims. He stopped panicking and started thinking. The problem wasn't the patch itself. It was the air pressure fighting against the patch when he inflated the tube. So he invented a new technique. Apply the patch while the tube is deflated. Let it cure partially, then inflate it slowly in stages, giving the patch time to bond under gradually increasing pressure. It worked. The hole sealed. The raft held AIR. Steven Callahan had just invented another survival technique on day 43. Now let's talk about something that will make you angry. Over 76 days, Steven spotted 9 ships, 9 chances to be rescued. 2 of them came within 1 mile of his raft. Steven set off flares, waved his arms, screamed until his voice was gone. Not a single ship saw him. Imagine that. Watching a massive cargo vessel sail right past you close enough to see people on deck, knowing they have food, water, safety, and they have no idea you're there, dying slowly on a raft. Most people would give up after the first ship, or the second, or the third. Steven didn't. He kept fishing, kept fixing his raft, kept navigating, kept surviving, because he understood something fundamental. Rescue might never come. He couldn't control that. But he could control whether he died today or survived to see tomorrow. So every morning, Steven woke up and made one choice: survive today. Not next week, not next month, just today. And he did that 76 times. By day 60, Steven was a skeleton. He'd lost over 40 pounds. His body weight was down to 95 pounds. His skin was covered in saltwater sores that wouldn't heal. His teeth were loose from malnutrition. His gums bled constantly. But he was still alive. And then, on April 20th, Steven saw something he hadn't seen in 2.5 months. Lights. He was drifting near an island called Marie Galante, southeast of Guadeloupe. The next morning, April 21st, Steven's 76th day on the raft, fishermen spotted him. But here's the crazy part about how they found him. Remember those Dorado fish? The ones Steven had been eating for 76 days? They'd created such a strong ecosystem around his raft that birds started gathering. Lots of birds, hovering over the water. The fishermen saw the birds and thought, there must be fish here. So they came to investigate and found Steven Callahan instead. The fish that kept him alive for 76 days, literally LED rescuers to him. When the fishermen pulled Steven aboard, he was barely conscious. One of them later said he looked more like a corpse than a living person. Steven was taken to a hospital. And here's what's insane. He spent one afternoon there. One afternoon. Then he discharged himself because, in his words, he was just hungry. Within weeks, Steven was recovering. Within months, he wrote a book about his experience. Adrift, 76 Days Lost at Sea. That book became a New York Times bestseller for 36 weeks. But the story doesn't end there. Because Steven Callahan didn't just survive, he changed how survival at sea works forever. The United States Navy studied everything Steven did. The knee depression fish attraction technique, now taught in naval survival training worldwide. The staged inflation method for patching inflatable rafts under pressure. Standard procedure for maritime rescue. The ecosystem understanding. Core curriculum for ocean survival courses. Steven holds 3 United States patents for maritime safety equipment. He designed a completely new type of life raft called the Clam. It has a rigid bottom to protect from sharks, a sail so you can navigate instead of just drifting, and a canopy that collects rainwater efficiently. That raft is now used by maritime organizations worldwide. And in 2012, when director Ang Lee was making Life of Pi, he hired Steven Callahan as a consultant. Steven taught the actors how to fish from a raft, how to collect water, how to survive psychologically when you're completely alone. If you've seen Life of Pi and thought the survival scenes looked realistic, now you know why. They were based on a man who actually lived it. So what's the lesson here? Steven Callahan wasn't superhuman. He wasn't some special forces operator with years of training. He was a regular 29-year-old guy who loved sailing. But he had 3 things that kept him alive. Preparation. He'd studied survival manuals and packed the right emergency gear. Adaptability. When his spear gun broke, he learned to spear by hand. When his solar stills failed, he fixed them. When ships didn't see him, he kept surviving anyway. And mindset. He focused on what he could control, not what he couldn't. He made daily choices to keep fighting. He turned problems into solutions. Those 3 things are why Steven Callahan survived 76 days when most people wouldn't last 76 hours. 76 days. 1,800 miles across the Atlantic Ocean. 1 man, 1 6-foot raft, and an ocean that refused to let him die. Now here's what blows my mind about this whole story. Steven's not the only person who's done this. There's a guy named Poon Lim who survived 133 days on a raft. 4 sailors who drifted for 119 days on an overturned boat. A crew that survived 4 months in similar conditions. The ocean is full of these impossible survival stories, and every single one of them proves the same thing. The human body can survive almost anything if the human mind refuses to quit. If you want to hear the story about those 4 sailors who survived on an overturned boat, the one Steven Callahan actually wrote a book about, let me know in the comments. Type next if you want that story, because that one is somehow even more insane than this one. When you think you've heard the craziest ocean survival tale, there's always one that's even more unbelievable. The ocean doesn't care about your plans. It doesn't care about fairness. It just exists, massive and indifferent. And the people who survive it, they're not the strongest. They're not the luckiest. They're the ones who refuse to give up when 99% of people would. Steven Callahan proved that in 1982, and his techniques are still saving lives 43 years later. That's the real legacy. Not just that he survived, but that he turned his nightmare into knowledge that protects others. That is what makes Steven Callahan's story legendary.